Alors, merci d'être venus, si nombreux, ce qu'on dit en France, avant les concerts. But I'm speaking in English. You may have noticed, some of you, that the title has changed, but the abstract content is still valid. And I changed the title because I'm talking not only about theories concerned with, or my theories concerned with spatiality, but also relating it to the works to be heard in the concert tonight. It was back in 1981, when I was 35, and had been composing acousmatic music for 10 years, only 10 years, that I started to conceive a framework for understanding sonic content and structural relations in acousmatic music, using as a starting point the types of morphology outlined in Pierre Schaeffer's Traité des objets musicaux. I invented the term Spectra Morphology to represent the idea of the components of the sound spectrum and how they are shaped through time. All sounds, whether in music or not, possess a spectromorphological identity, a particular configuration of spectral energy. When we identify sounds and respond to them, we are decoding their spectromorphological imprint. Since in acousmatic music we are liable to encounter almost any sound, we need to have a means of describing and differentiating what we hear. This is particularly useful for uncovering the pertinent attributes of sounds whose sources and causes we cannot recognize, which is often the case in acousmatic music. But it is equally useful for getting to grips with the pertinent attributes of any sounds we may encounter in an acousmatic context, whatever their provenance. So concepts based on morphologies of sounds, how they move, how they change through time, and how they behave together in a given musical context should be useful for discussing or analyzing how the music works, and what we find rewarding or disappointing about it. The term spectromorphology is not intended as an objective scientific concept. I am not so interested in using literal acoustic analyses of sound, although of course these can help us probe the internal details of spectromorphologies. I am much more interested in sound as apprehended by the ear, the changes in spectral energies as heard. And I believe that listeners instinctively respond to the energetic physicality and qualities of spectral shapes. In fact, that is what we do when we respond to the qualities and impact of a performance of, say, tonal instrumental music. It is not only a matter of pitches, harmony, and rhythm. When I first wrote about spectromorphology, I only tentatively tackled the concept of space, both in the fabric of the music and in the context of the listening space, which is where we encounter the music, whether this be in a studio, or at home, or in a concert space. I now regard the spatiality of acousmatic music as the most original and striking aspect of its identity. Listeners can be offered a unique and concentrated spatial experience. In my 2007 article, Space, Form, and the Acousmatic Image, I developed the idea that the spatial image could provide the basis for understanding and discussing a wide range of styles of acousmatic music. The metaphor of the image represented the idea that a number of factors collectively contribute to create and reveal a spatially based form as the music progresses through time. Spatiality accumulates over time, so spatiality and time are inextricably linked. Our daily experience of space is concerned with energy and its release as we move through space, as we carry out our daily tasks, as we observe and participate in activity, as we witness environmental phenomena. The spectromorphological energies of acousmatic music function in a similar way. They are deployed in space, and they reveal space. They generate and articulate space. The spatiality of the acousmatic image can be investigated by diagnosing the relationship among three key concepts: perspectival space, source-bonded space, and spectral space, which need to be considered in relation to how the music is perceived and received in the physical context of a listening space. Here are the preliminary definitions of the three concepts. Although I shall be discussing the three concepts individually, in practice they are intertwined. thinking about space in terms of perspective is the most familiar, since it is associated with most composers' minds with spatialization, the apparent localization, placement, and movement of sounds among loudspeakers. However, the spatiality of acousmatic music is more complex and interesting than just that. Now, spatial images are always present in an acousmatic work, though they may not always be the main conscious focus of the listener's attention. However, when I talk to listeners about their reactions to acousmatic pieces, I find that they often resort to spatial expressions or metaphors in order to articulate their experience of the music. In acousmatic music, which comes over loudspeakers, there is nothing to watch. We only listen. We do not witness any causal gestures producing sound. We do not see the sounding sources. However, the acousmatic image, though purely sonic, does not refer only to sonic experience and sonic phenomena. Acousmatic music perception is bound up with the totality of our sensory motor experience. In our imagination, what we hear crosses over into what we learn and know of the world via the collaboration amongst the sense modes, even if these modes are not directly activated in order only to listen. For example, texture we know to be physical, sense of touch, and visual, not just or even primarily oral. When we mentally take in the motion of sounds, we refer to our kinesthetic experience and to our visual observation of motion, our multifaceted experiences of space. So transmodal sensory experience is implicated in the acousmatic image. Although the image is carried by sound, its meaning and significance can be understood only by reference to transsensory experience, to our bodily experience of space, our corporality. The corporality of the listener is central to acousmatic music and to spatiality in general. As a listener perceiver, I am at the center of my world, my ego center. The acousmatic image is laid out before me, around me. Spatial perspective is viewed from my vantage point. I focus on the image unfolding before me. I'm most engaged by what is happening in front of me within the visual field. I do not pay as much attention to what is behind me, by what passes out of the visual field. I observe, I scan the passing image, I seek out what interests me or what strikes me. Hopefully, I'm attentive. How I relate to the image depends on how I decode the sonic materials and spatial image, and that depends on my previous experience, what I bring to the act of listening. This is difficult and uncertain territory for the composer, who cannot know the range of each listener's experience and the facets of the listener's memory and self-imagination which the acousmatic image might trigger. Here, the idea of the source-bondedness of sounds is a very important factor. Source bonding being the natural tendency to relate sounds to supposed sources and causes, and to relate sounds to each other because they appear to have shared or associated origins. The listener attempts to identify and deduce the sources of sounds. The word bonding is used here to indicate the strength of an almost involuntary reflex. We can't help trying to decode sources. I am bound to think of or imagine an associated kind of object, substance, or sounding body. Source-bonded sounds may actually be taken from the real world, or their attributes or behavior may remind me of a real-world sound or circumstance. Where sources and causes are obvious, source bonding is inevitable. But ambiguity is rife. Confident recognition is intermingled with allusion and illusion. And the listener is liable to invent source bondings even for what the composer might regard as the most abstract of sounds. As listeners, we project acquired cultural, communal, and personalized experiences into the music. The generation of meaning is a fusion of the music and us. Decoding sources and causes is only part of the initial stage of uncovering the image. It is, after all, the attributes of the sounds, their combination, their relationships, their behaviors, their context that matter. how the larger image is composed, and how it emerges over time. Source-bonded sounds all carry spatial implications. A spatial image is conjured up. Source-bonded space carries with it an image of the kind of activity or phenomenon which we assume might have produced or caused the sound. For example, if I detect that the released spectral energy I hear is instigated by a person, by an agent, then I envisage the physical action involved. This whole process, from cause to source, from energy activated to its release or disappearance, is a spatial act, and I construct a possible image of its enactment. It is enacted space. When we listen to a stereo orchestral recording at home, we can imagine the whole expanse of the performing space and the spread of the orchestra, even though the panoramic space of the image is compressed between two loudspeakers only a few meters apart. Curiously, in my mind, the source-bonded space carried by the image is much larger in scale than the actual space between the loudspeakers, the perspectival space. I have reconstructed what I imagine to be the real space where the recording took place. If I were to listen to the same recording through a single mono earpiece, I can still reconstruct a full panoramic expanse, even though the only perspectival information remaining is the depth of the image, the acoustic of the recording space. There is no panoramic spread at all. I can create the source-bonded space in my imagination because I know what an orchestra is, how it is physically laid out, and what it sounds like. In the acousmatic image, source-bonded and perspectival space may be closely associated or contradictory, and the composer can play inventively with this potential. Source-bonded space in collaboration with perspectival space is hardly ever real, in the sense that it is an exact replica of the real world. For example, microtextures are quite prevalent in acousmatic music. Think of water or wood-like textures. Spectrally, clearly defined as if next to my ear, magnified, exaggerated, moving in expansive clouds and panoramic space. There is a contradiction between a type of texture which in our minds is made up of microcomponents, heard or viewed as if close up, but which are not physically close to me in my vantage point. They are some distance away from my egocentric space. The intimacy of the sound is projected from a distance. And the expansiveness of the motion is not what I would expect such a source-bonded texture in reality. While such textural motion remains source-bonded, the perspectival aspect transforms it into a dramatic, possibly surreal spatial image. And perhaps my imagination might wander to comparable images of cloud-like motions formed by other types of materials, or maybe call up other motion-based spatial images. The appearance of a source-bonded sound can change the listener's view of the spatial image of the perspectival space. There is a simple example in my piece Resounding to be heard in this evening's concert, where the arrival of a cadential organ phrase leads the listener suddenly to decode the acoustic space as the image of a church. A specific interpretation is accorded to the ongoing, generalized spatial context. Without the organ, the significance of the spatial setting would be more anonymous, uncertain, and the organ cadence occurs for a second time, slightly differently, just to make sure. In spectral lands, which you will also hear this evening, source bonding plays a more formative role in the spatial settings and events than in many of my pieces, although just how explicit this is for some other listeners, I'm not so sure. It's a problem. Even so, I try to maintain a certain ambiguity, affording scope for listeners to delve into their own imaginations. Human presence is rare in my music. Why? Because I think I find environments with no human presence more evocative, more contemplative, open expanses, forests, the Aptly Cathedral, deserted beaches in New Zealand, the Way de Garrigue in the Corbière in the south of France, where I spent half the year. Ambiguous voices and far less ambiguous birds have their presence in spectral lands. Source-bonded space and perspectival space merge, and I play with contrasting viewpoints, contrasting prospects, that is in prospective space, located and spread between distal and proximate space, a play of scale and depth. For example, the feeling that you are at the edge of a spatial scene or setting, or looking into a space beyond, perhaps even beyond the confines of the listening space, as if at the threshold, for example, of a cave. And these prospective views are contrasted with a more immersive and proximate environment, a kind of habitat where the watching corporeal listener shares space with the sound images. And all these can exist concurrently. Then there is a wide repertory of noise-based and granular materials, like the kind of magnified textural microactivity I referred to earlier, turbulent, volatile, mobile, linked to reality, even though not that real. In terms of spatiality, the threesome of perspectival space, source-bonded space, and the spatiality of spectral space collaborate closely. I'm sorry I can't play examples, since these are multi-track works and need to be carefully set up. But maybe on the other hand, I'm not so sorry, because I wouldn't want you to color your listening so much and take scenes out of their context. I want to turn now to spectral spatiality. The spectral dimension is the vertical fabric of the music where sounds, individually or as textured participants, lie, move and change within the boundaries of high and the low. I prefer to regard this broad territory as spectral space, but where intervallic perception is pertinent, I may refer to the term pitch space. Let me try and deal with pitch space first. Pitch space is a particular division of spectral space, striated in incremental semitonal steps. The registration of pitch space in tonal music, its division into registers or regions, is based on the octave. And the gravitational pull of the music, both towards note centers and octave regions, is oriented by goal-oriented chord progressions and key modulations, so that movements up and down in pitch space have historically acquired typical behavioral shapes, which we can't escape. In fact, they're culturally acquired. Although instrumental composers may not consciously be thinking of pitch space in terms of spatiality, one can often be drawn to spatial qualities resulting from pitch deployment, whether in tonal music or less tonal music, particularly in a recording where in acousmatic listening one is encouraged to concentrate on sound and forget about the source-bonded visual and physical action of performers with instruments. Titles which appeal to spatial images are influential too, and there are many of them. The potential freedom and flexibility of motion within spectral space and the more precise and systematic organization of pitch space can work together, as they often do in my music. I try to travel fluently in and out of pitched environments. I can benefit from activating the affective qualities that have come to be associated with intervallic progressions. Sometimes these may be quite brief motives, sometimes recurring intervallic centers or longer melodic spines, as found in spectral lands. And pitch centers also feature in the much earlier piece Wind Chimes, composed in 1986, which is in tonight's concert. In my music, pitches and intervals sometimes provide points of reference, secreted within textures, orienting the listener in an exploration of the internal design of spectral space. More generally, whether the listener can decode a sense of spatiality from how and where spectral morphologies are deployed in spectral space depends on their motion and behavior and how they relate to one another over stretches of time. The opening of Valley Flow is an example of a fairly abstract sketch, or what I regard as a fairly abstract sketch, in spectral space that relies on slightly thin distal spectral bands and ascending and descending contours, all of them what I call graduated continuant morphologies, meaning that they are relatively unpressured in their appearances and departures. The focus is on their graduated continuity. Graduated continuant or sustained strands and layers, whether high or low, are very useful for suggesting spacious expanses. And over longer periods of time than is the case here, they can take on a certain timelessness. Here, higher levitated spectral regions are outlined, using only a few sustained but grained strokes of sound. A sense of spaciousness is aided by the gaps between the lines and the glides among them. It is the entry of a lower morphological push that finally tells us more about the extent of the spectral space scale. This opening evolution of spectral space is primarily responsible for creating the basic spatial image of the piece. You will have noticed the tendencies of the rising and falling contours that steer the flow of the spectral space and the effect of the gravitational pull and float towards lower regions. The gaps between the high strands and the lower push tend to suggest the extent of the vertical dimension at the start of the piece. The focus moves more towards the mid-range with the first approach from distal space towards proximate space. The deployment of sounds in spectral space does not inevitably evoke impressions of spatiality. Although the composer is by definition always working in the spectral domain, it is after all the very matter of sound, spatial qualities are not always evoked. In fact, there are many acousmatic pieces where the spectral dimension is not a significant contributor to spatiality. In other words, the spectral space is not really explored fully. In listening to acousmatic music, we are not necessarily conscious of how or whether spectral factors contribute to a sense of spatiality. The relative highness or lowness of sounds is not inevitably in the forefront of our perception. If you want to become more conscious of spectral spatiality, you have to listen out specifically for multiple contributing factors, including the influence of source bonding. This is a kind of reduced listening where you temporarily block out other aspects of the music, not something we naturally do, but it is something that I, as a composer, have to be practiced at if I am going to exploit the expressive potential of spectral spatiality. Ultimately, spectral spatiality is often so closely bound up with perspectival space that the two are integrated to such a degree it is not realistic or feasible to separate them out. In fact, spectral space is perspectival. Without verticality, the spatial image could not exist. And working with degrees of brightness of the spectrum, for example, the resolution of the spectrum, that is a way of controlling the perceived distance of the sound from the listener. There is a tendency in large loudspeaker systems to use higher, smaller loudspeakers to diffuse higher spectral morphologies in order to locate them physically higher in the listening space. But this is not essential. Given the right listening conditions, including good loudspeakers, carefully placed, given appropriate spectral morphologies, for example, smaller impulse sounds or thinner strands, and providing there is sufficient energy at work within certain critical frequency bands, higher frequency stimuli have a tendency to be perceived as being higher up in space, regardless of their actual spatial positioning. After concerts where spectral spatiality has effectively been doing its work, in discussion with me and fellow composers, listeners have been known to comment on the effectiveness of the deployment of height in the space, assuming that height has been delivered by the speakers mounted higher in the space, when they have not been used at all. The listener is easily deceived by seeing loudspeakers and mistrusts the ear. Our physiology, the patterns of reflection and diffraction of our pinnae, is a fundamental factor in the perception of height. But a range of other factors, environmental and cultural, are also influential, and source bonding plays its part too. For example, we all have experience of small and large resonating objects and materials. In music, mobile configurations in higher registers appear lighter. Lower sounds of larger mass and density are more cumbersome in their motility, if indeed they do move. They are spectrally less clear. They tend to be perceived as having more weight, and their spatial localization is less clearly defined than higher sounds. Among the cultural factors at work, I can include our heritage of musical figures in Western music, rhetorical figures and symbolic references in Baroque music, for example, in orchestral music where registers and types of motions are allied to programmatic intentions, and so on. Despite the difficulty and sometimes questionable viability of breaking down the spectral dimension into its components, we do need some means of getting to grips with spectral matter. It is therefore helpful to be able to refer to a number of generalized notions to help designate those areas or fields of the spectral dimension where spectral morphologies reside and act. Thus the idea of spectral space, states, and occupancy. It's not that a state is necessarily a stable slice in time, but it's convenient to think of states. The attributes briefly sketched out on the slide may be applied at a variety of structural levels depending on musical context. From a small-scale individual spectral morphology to a macro structure made up of many elements, from a unified entity to something more diffuse, from a context of short duration to accumulations of sound over longer passages. And so we see on the slide the first idea of boundaries and extent, that is the upper and lower limits, and the nature of the intervening space. The idea of registration to do with spectral distributions, regions, spreads, concentrations, layers, gaps, whether they're set out in contiguous spectral space or non-contiguous, and the focus of registration focus, the attention drawn to particular regions or particular points in the regions. Grounding and suspending. Suspended spectral space is unsupported from below. It seems unsupported with any baseline or is not rooted in any base frequencies, and may give an impression of levitation. Grounding implies that spectral space has its foundations in the base region. Density is laid out there. Weight is to do with heaviness and lightness, and you can deduce it by looking at the spectrum morphological type and its registral behavior and the nature of its density, and of course whether it actually moves in perspectival space. And finally, fusion and fission, how far the spectrum of a spectrum morphology or a structure or texture is unified over the extent of its spectral space. Spectral space is almost always changing over time, so we also need to consider attributes of motion. But this is a large topic, and I do not intend to pursue it in detail today. I just offer you a few general pointers. Motion is concerned with morphological evolution and change in spectral space occupancy over time. We start with the simple idea of directionality and how it is guided, pulled, or attracted towards regions in spectral space, whether up or down. Then comes the notion of accretion and its opposite process, attrition. Then, recognizing that the pace of change varies and is not necessarily stable, we need to consider the styles of mobility of spectral energy. Motion and energy can have mobile interiors, and so texturing descriptors are useful, particularly those relating to the internal consistency of sounds, their smoothness, roughness, or granularity. To try and summarize some of the ideas I've talked about, let's listen to another excerpt taken from later in Valley Flow. I'm not going to offer a commentary on the passage. I'm sure you will be able to appreciate some of the aspects of how perspectival, source-bonded, and spectral aspects collaborate to create spatiality and spatial images. I wish finally to return to the context of the listener in the listening space in order to make some remarks about listening conditions and the reception of spatiality. And here I'm talking about containment and transcendence, which you see defined there, and there's a little diagram that shows the interrelationship between the continuum of containment and transcendence and acousmatic image scales in relation to listening space scale. A very simple diagram. While as inhabitants of space we are central to the spatiality of the acousmatic image, these images can also carry us far beyond the spaces we inhabit from day to day. Acousmatic spatial forms and images possess a certain reality in the sense that we apprehend them as they inhabit perspectival space with us. But these same spectral energies articulate new spaces for us to inhabit, for us to contemplate. In living with us, they change our spaces. But they can also transport us beyond our immediate egocentric space. Our vantage point becomes transcended. That is what perspectival space, source-bonded space, and spectral space conspire to do, as designed by the composer and as delivered in listening space. But listening contexts come in many shapes and sizes. Sound quality is extremely variable amongst different makes of loudspeakers, and the number and positioning of loudspeakers in relation to egocentric vantage points is very changeable. As a result, the acousmatic work, far from being fixed, can be very different from space to space. It can be enhanced or even be destroyed depending on the influence of the many variables relating to the listening context and conditions. Prospective space, in which I include any panoramic extension to around 100 degrees either side of egocentric space, remains the most favored aspect of perspectival space because we are most used to attending to it in detail, orally, visually, physically, and because most of our encounters in life have a prospective orientation. Hence, the acousmatic composer's inevitable use of such perspectival conventions as exploring proximate distal relations. The closest sound provide a proximate core. Images spread out to create more expansive fields and may recede to suggest distant horizons, far beyond the confines of the listening space. Sounds approach and recede, open out, close in, and enclose, and may envelop us in circumspace. Proximate distal depth is not pertinent in all spatial directions. In any case, considering the physical conditions of listening spaces, whether at home or in an auditorium, and the nature of loudspeaker installations, it is rarely practicable for the composer to create detailed circumspatial proximate distal images for all orientations. The reception of the depth of field is very much influenced by the physical depth of the listening space. In a small space, even though the depth of field may suggest spaces beyond the wall I am facing, transcending the confines of the listening space, the listener may feel cramped by the image. On the other hand, in a large space, where there is some distance between the closest frontal loudspeakers and the front wall, the image is more liable to be perceived as dwelling in the space, contained within it. Thus, the composed image depth can expand or contract depending on the scale of the seen and physically experienced space. So vision can influence the decoding of perspectival space. There are no prescribed rules for predicting what will happen, and much depends on what the image content might evoke. So in composing spatiality, I always pay attention to the potential for the image to transcend the space. I always seek an extended depth of field and work on a variety of depth perspectives. Similar observations apply to the scale of the listening space as a whole, its volume. Some acousmatic works adapt well to fill larger volumes. They project well. Others may get lost. And some works feel uncomfortable or trapped in smaller spaces. In composing spatiality, I pay attention to the contiguity of the image to make sure that more expansive images create contiguous space. They join up, and I'm particularly interested in creating holistic spaces. For example, sustained resonances, whether grounded or suspended, are very good at doing this. And I have to be careful about the velocity of traveling trajectories to make sure that undesirable gaps in the image do not open up when loudspeakers are further apart in a large space. In other words, when composing in my home studio, I have to bear in mind what will happen to the spatiality of the image in larger spaces where there are greater distances among loudspeakers. And if there is too great a distance among loudspeakers, there will be image problems. And what about height? Higher ceilings create a feeling of spaciousness, whereas low ceilings can be too claustrophobic. If I want the higher regions of spectral spatiality to be effective, there needs to be a sufficient volume of empty space above my head. Ideally, I prefer that listeners are not aware of the loudspeakers as emitters of sound, as point sources, as boxes that throw sound into the listening space. But many composers like that. I wish listeners to attend to the spatiality of the image, not the loudspeakers. Much depends, of course, on the composer's skills and on how loudspeaker diffusion systems are managed in performance and what they actually comprise, their number and the format of the music. And then there is the problem caused by the precedence effect, whereby the sound from the closest loudspeaker will arrive at your ears first, masking the sounds from other loudspeakers and upsetting the equilibrium of the sounding space, in fact, ruining your listening. You hate the piece as a result because you can't listen to it properly. Thus, the legibility of the image can be distorted if your vantage point is disadvantaged. This is particularly an issue in installations where lateral loudspeakers are aimed directly at the side of the audience. In fact, I find this a frequent irritation. There are ways of offsetting the precedence effect. Delays is one of them. I now work with spectral decorrelation software to create what I call circumspectral space, where the spectrum of a sound or passage or texture is split up into narrower or wider frequency bands which are placed or scattered in circumspace so that every loudspeaker is diffusing a different set of frequencies. No single speaker is reproducing the full spectrum on its own. Thus, the listener's physical proximity to a speaker will have a less detrimental impact on the experience of the perspectival image. And I can compose with different vantage points in mind so that viable images will be available in different parts of the space. And there are other advantages. More detail of spectral spatiality can be revealed. I can create subtle perspectival variations and different image spreads, playing with spatial volumes, and delocalizations. Spectral Lands is the first work where I explore some of these possibilities. But you would only become aware of the results if you could listen to the work several times from different vantage points, or else possibly move around during a performance. I often find that in circumspatial works, there is too much movement in perspectival space. Excessive movement, particularly constant rapid movement, soon becomes tedious rather than invigorating, quickly becoming cliched, and eventually one loses the desire to pay attention. Which types of spectral morphology in themselves suggest a viable motility or are most useful for creating movement? To move or not to move, that is the question. And why move? You have to have a reason for doing so. In my view, there needs to be a certain equilibrium between movement and stability, a range of approaches to temporality, to the psychology of time passing, to the durations needed for the spatiality of the image to form, and to be drawn into and contemplate the interiors of spectral spatiality, we need time to focus, time to explore, thus a certain stability. Responding to the spatiality of the acousmatic image is something we all normally do without thinking too much about it. The reason why spatiality is hard to grasp is that we listen to it via the manifold identities and configurations of sonic content, the spectral energies that produce space. We do not listen only to space itself. We have to listen to space, if we want to, via the images. Composing spatiality requires a specialized type of concentrated listening that can only be acquired if one becomes conscious of the factors that contribute to the perception and reception of the acousmatic image and how it relates to wider spatial experience. so that in working with perspectival space, source-bonded space, and spectral space, the composer will be able to create special experiences of acousmatic spatiality. So spatially based forms and space as form, the idea of space as form, are key in understanding the expressiveness of the acousmatic image. They are central rather than peripheral, and I think we need to shift our focus of musical investigation away from conceiving of music always as units in time, as stretches of time, as having functions in time, to give pride of place to space and spatiality, at least treating time and space more as collaborating partners, and even sometimes going as far as to place time at the service of space. In exploring spatiality in the acousmatic image, we may think we crossed over a frontier into new territory many years ago when stereo began. I'm sure those working then thought so. And as perspectival spatial practice in its various guises has grown up, it has changed, and we've thought we've crossed another frontier. And we may still think today that in an era of circumspace we have matured, but I think there is still much more to be understood and explored in spatiality as a medium of human expression, both in theory and in practice. Thank you very much.